Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics, your bite-sized guide to the corridors of power. I'm Stephen Carroll.
And I'm Yuan. Welcome to the programme. So we're officially in the final straight, 1 week until polling day. Many people have already voted via postal votes. I don't know about you, Stephen, but it's all felt like a bit of a whirlwind to me. We started off in the pouring rain on Downing Street with that surprise announcement of a July election. Who would have bet on that? And now here we are in the midst of a heat wave, just 7 days out, and the final head-to-head TV debate done and dusted. It's all been a bit of a blur.
The other way I think about this, though, is I sort of feel like this election, we've been warming up to it for a year or possibly more. In some ways, I think it feels like the longest election campaign that I can remember in a long time. Commentators and pollsters, though, aren't really convinced that any of it has really changed in the past couple of weeks when it comes to voting intentions, though. Looking at the numbers, that crucial gap between Labour and the Conservatives has stayed roughly the same in recent weeks, but smaller parties like Reform UK and the Lib Dems have made important gains. So has it all been worth it? And more importantly, have the electorate been watching and listening?
Well, something that's definitely been a constant throughout the campaign for us is our Bloomberg election panel. They are Alice Perry, former chair of Labour's National Executive Committee, Luisa Porritt, former Liberal Democrat member of the European Parliament, and Chris Wilkins, former speechwriter to Theresa May, all here in the studio. Lovely to see you all. Luisa, I just wanted to start by asking you, I know you've been out on the campaign trail in the last couple of weeks. What's it been like out there on the doorstep?
Really interesting for the Liberal Democrats because certainly the last few weeks have seen a bit of a change for the party in that seats have come into play that weren't deemed to be in play necessarily at the beginning of when the election was called. The slightly more outside bets, if you like. So LDHQ is certainly feeling much more buoyant as the weeks have gone on, and there are teams now going from seats deemed to be in quite a secure position to seats that are much further down the target list. There's always a risk contained in that as well, but I think obviously we're in such a unique political landscape at the moment where we don't know exactly how far the Conservative vote is going to fall, that it's bringing all these different seats into play. I know we were speaking just before we went on air about Harpenden and Berkhamsted as an example. That's an entirely new seat that is made up of parts of three former constituencies.
So it's going to be an interesting one to watch.
Voters don't necessarily all know what their tactical voting option is because it's quite new. And so I think there are some places like Wimbledon as well where there's a bit of confusion. Do you vote Liberal Democrat? Obviously, I would say that. Or do you vote Labour? They're also working that seat.
And other
hard.
options are available. And of course, you can find the full list of your candidates on your local council's websites when it comes to all of these constituencies. Alice, I want to turn to you next. If we talk about, I suppose, what people are interested in on the campaign trail. You know, we're very focused obviously on all the economic issues here, but what's coming up in conversations with voters? What are people most exercised about?
I mean, it depends where you are in the country and the demographics of the seat you're in. I was campaigning in the elections just gone by, and someone wanted to have a half an hour conversation about electoral reform, but that's Walthamstow for you. That is not reflective of the rest of the country.
Louisa's dream.
I know, and we've really got into the different systems.
One about PR this time.
Yeah, so what we're finding around the country, stuff that comes up all the time. Obviously, the cost of living crisis is a big issue for people. The NHS and concerns about waiting times, availability of appointments, stuff like that. Also, general sense that the country is in a state of decline, and concerns about the future and if people's children will have as good a life as they've been having. And honestly, immigration comes up as well, and that is an issue. And for some voters, it comes fourth, but for those voters, it's the number one issue, and that's why you'll see a lot of the discourse from Labour, the Conservatives, and Reform talking about this. And it's a difficult thing to navigate. And as Ed Miliband found, you can't just stick controls on immigration on a mug. That doesn't actually work with the electorate. So the approach Labour are taking around talking about smashing the criminal gangs and working better cross borders is a good line to take, but it's something that does come up as well. And like particularly in those, because the thing of our electoral system is there are certain constituencies where like, you know, hundreds of votes decide the outcome of the next election. And for a lot of those bellwether seats, these are the kind of issues that really matter. And if the Conservatives can take back some of that vote from Reform, the size of Labour's majority dramatically decreases. So I take all those polls with a pinch of salt, and like really they concern me. I don't think Labour are about to win a 200-seat majority. I'd love it, but we will see. 1 week to go.
Chris, a huge amount of noise. Do you think we've actually learned anything during this campaign? Have any minds been changed?
I'm not sure, actually, that many have. I think the fundamental dynamic in this campaign really was set probably before it began, which is that people are voting against the Conservative Party. And so I think everything Alice talked about is absolutely right in terms of the policy issues that come up. But actually what we're seeing, and what we've seen for a long time, we've seen it in parliamentary by-elections, we saw it in the sort of council elections, etc. recently, is people are finding ways to vote against the Conservative Party after 14 years in power, and that's why we are where we are. So to some extent, I think that was sort of set. I'm not sure the campaign was ever going to change that significantly. Now, Rishi Sunak has obviously tried to make this, frankly, about tax. That's the thing. That's the dividing line the Conservatives have alighted on. You saw that in the debate this week. He's trying to make that all about tax because that speaks to his base ultimately, and also to some of those potentially some of those Reform voters he needs to win back. I think the Conservatives sort of feel reasonably happy that they have made that a central issue, and they have, Labour have been a bit on the back foot on it. But ultimately, do I think it's going to shift the dial? Do I think it's going to move things massively? Not really, because ultimately that's the dynamic. People just want to vote against the Conservatives wherever they are, and that's the legacy of 14 years as much as anything.
And do you think that message on tax is starting to get through? Because it's often said that you need to repeat something, ad infinitum for people to actually mention it back to you on the doorstep. Do you think it's sinking in, that message on Labour tax rises?
I think it's been successful in framing a lot of the conversation. I think people will have heard the message, and I think there are legitimate questions about how Labour are going to pay for a lot of the things in their manifesto, and Keir Starmer says it's all about growth. Well, we'd all like growth, but how do you get that, etc. So it's a legitimate discussion. I think they have successfully made it a central issue in the campaign, but as I say, ultimately that is not what I think a lot of people are going to be voting on, next week. That is not the central determining factor for why people are going to go out and vote, and that's the problem for the Conservative Party.
Luisa, I can hear listening to you that you're getting excited about this, and I think that's probably been the shift that you've seen over this campaign as well, as it looks like a window or a door is opening for the Liberal Democrats. Is this a Nick Clegg moment for Lib Dems?
It's a great question, and we always like to think that at every election. So I've talked over the weeks about being slightly cautious, because even in the Nick Clegg high point, we didn't quite reach the level that was anticipated right before the election actually took place. But look, I do think the Liberal Democrats are going to make gains. I do think a hurdle has been passed now, sort of post-coalition, where the party has really struggled to get back into a stronger position. And I think we'll see a stronger parliamentary party after this election. Exact numbers, really hard to tell. 50 seats is being talked about. But let's not forget, if it's 25, that's still an achievement from where the Liberal Democrats were. And it's still something much stronger to build on for the next election in the future as well.
And do you think that the days of the coalition are forgotten now? Do people still bring that up on the doorstep?
I don't really find it, to be honest, including in the elections that I stood in, which were a while ago now. So I think voters have moved on. As Chris has pointed out, their main concern is about seeing a change of government at this point, which is why the Labour slogan is quite clever, actually, just having that word change. And certainly it's what the Liberal Democrats are talking about in the seats where the party is competitive with the Conservatives as well. And that is resonating. People just feel like nothing works in this country anymore. And also Rishi Sunak, putting aside the fact he's had a pretty disastrous campaign, is being punished for perceived mistakes of his predecessors as well. Liz Truss's mini budget, Boris Johnson and Partygate, Brexit in the mix as well. So I'm sure it's not much fun being a Conservative canvasser right now.
Alice, I wonder how big a fear there is around complacency in the Labour camp. You know, we've talked in previous elections about the shy Tory. Is there a reverse version of that where people are saying overtly they're going to vote Labour because it seems to be, you know, talked about a lot as the prospects of the election come closer? Is there a risk that some of those people won't actually follow through?
It's always a concern about voter apathy, and that's like a long-term trend as well. There are a lot of people, you know, especially in a summer election as well. And if people want change, they need to vote for it. And there's a concern that with people seeing the polls and a big push to vote for smaller parties, and I don't count the Liberal Democrats in this, but like independent candidates or others, you know, you could see quite an interesting and diverse parliament. And actually, when you drill into some of the independent candidates' views, like the candidate standing in Birmingham Ladywood, for example, they found a podcast he'd recorded where he'd made some really awful misogynistic comments and stuff, or some of the Reform candidates that have been found to be racist. Once you actually do this kind of scrutiny, which is why due diligence is so important and worth investing in, that's one of the things that the mainstream parties are very good at. It's actually very hard to find and do the due diligence to get enough candidates to stand in an election. So it's always a concern that when you're looking this far ahead, and those polls like the Uniform National Swing is not going to come into play. In each constituency there'll be local issues. The candidate might have incumbency. There might be a popular local candidate that bucks the national trend. There's so much going on.
Play for it, and
exactly.
some of those local factors very important. Chris,
Yeah.
I wanted to just go to you briefly on this as well. Is there any light in this for Conservatives that are looking at it down the ballot box next week?
Difficult to find some, but for Conservatives next week and when the exit poll drops, you know, the figure that's in mind is 165. So in 1997, that was what the Conservatives were left with. Anything approaching that this time around is actually a pretty good result, given what some of the polls are suggesting. And really, the dynamic for next week is not so much what happens to Labour. Do you know what? I think they're going to win. Spoiler alert. The question is actually where are the Liberal Democrats? And as Louisa says, is it 25, is it 50? Because that will make the difference ultimately in where the Conservatives end up.
Yeah, despite all the polls, I still think the result in a week's time, 8 days' time, is still very much up in the air where the seats all fall. So it's going to be fascinating. That's it for our election panel. Alice Perry, former chair of Labour's National Executive Committee, Luisa Porritt, former Liberal Democrat member of the European Parliament, and Chris Wilkins, former speechwriter to Theresa May, all here with us in the studio.
And that's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe, give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo, and our audio engineers were Sean Gostamakia and Peter Nicolini. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more on Monday. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.